The old cabin creaked in the mountain wind as Commander Sarah Chen stared at her coffee mug, watching steam rise in lazy spirals. After 15 years of deep space missions and first contact scenarios, she'd chosen this remote spot in the Colorado Rockies to escape. No more protocols, no more diplomatic crises, no more aliens. Just her, the mountains, and blessed silence. A flash of light outside shattered that illusion. Sarah was on her feet instantly, muscle memory taking over as she grabbed the plasma pistol from its hiding spot beneath the kitchen sink. The light grew brighter, painting the cabin walls in an otherworldly blue glow. She knew that signature, a ship entering atmosphere and close. So much for retirement, she muttered, pulling on her boots and stepping onto the porch. The vessel wasn't large, maybe 20 feet across, with sleek lines that seemed to absorb the moonlight. It touched down in her clearing with surprising grace, barely disturbing the pine needles. Sarah kept her weapon ready but pointed down. 15 years of experience told her if they'd wanted trouble, they wouldn't have landed in plain sight. The ship's hull rippled like water, and a doorway simply appeared. 2 figures emerged, their movements careful in Earth's gravity. They were clearly female, their skin a deep purple that seemed to shimmer in the starlight. Both wore form-fitting environmental suits that pulsed with subtle bioluminescence. Commander Chen, the taller one, called out in perfect English. "We apologize for the intrusion, but we need your help." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. "You have me at a disadvantage. You know who I am, but I don't know you." "I am First Scholar Lyra," the tall one said, "and this is my research partner Nova. We are from the Cetacean Alliance." Sarah relaxed slightly. The cetaceans were known for their peaceful scientific pursuits, though they rarely ventured to Earth. "What brings 2 cetacean scholars to my doorstep?" Nova stepped forward, her movements almost dance-like in the low gravity. "We are anthropologists studying how different species adapt to varied environments. We're particularly interested in human resilience and adaptability." "And you picked my doorstep because you bridge 2 worlds," Lyra explained. "You understand both human isolation and interstellar diplomacy. We hoped you might help us understand the middle ground." Sarah holstered her weapon with a sigh. "Look, I left that life behind. I'm not interested in being anyone's research subject." "We understand," Nova said quickly. "We don't wish to disturb your solitude. We simply need a safe place to observe and learn while our ship undergoes necessary repairs. 2 standard Earth weeks, nothing more." Sarah studied them carefully. Her training told her they were being truthful, or at least believed they were. And something else nagged at her, a familiar loneliness in their eyes. She recognized it from her own mirror. 2 weeks, she said finally. "But we need ground rules." First, a distant rumble cut her off. All 3 women looked up to see a massive ship breaking through the clouds, its hull bearing the distinctive markings of Earth's Space Defense Force. "Inside," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the authority of her former rank. "Now." The aliens didn't argue, quickly following her into the cabin. Sarah's mind raced as she closed the door. The SDF didn't patrol this area randomly. Either they tracked Lyra and Nova's landing, or— "There's something you're not telling me," she said, turning to face her unexpected guests. "Why is the SDF looking for you?" Lyra and Nova exchanged glances. "We may have bypassed some standard immigration protocols," Lyra admitted. "You're illegal aliens," Sarah said, unable to suppress a small laugh at the irony. "Literally." "Our research is considered controversial by some," Nova explained. "We believe that isolationist policies are holding both our species back. We seek to prove that humans and cetaceans can coexist and learn from each other naturally, without diplomatic oversight." Sarah pinched the bridge of her nose. "So you decided to prove it by breaking every interspecies contact law on the books." "When you say it like that," Lyra began, but the whine of approaching aircraft cut her off. Sarah made a decision. Basement now. There's a hidden room behind the wine rack. I'll deal with the SDF. As she watched them disappear down the stairs, Sarah couldn't help but smile. 2 weeks with illegal alien anthropologists who wanted to study human culture. It wasn't exactly the quiet retirement she'd planned, but maybe that wasn't what she really needed anyway. The cabin creaked again in the mountain wind, but this time it sounded less lonely. As searchlights began sweeping the clearing outside, Sarah grabbed her coffee mug and settled into her favorite chair. Time to put those diplomatic skills to use one more time. She had a feeling these next 2 weeks were going to be very interesting indeed. The Space Defense Force officers weren't subtle about their search. Their boots thundered on Sarah's porch as they knocked, hard enough to rattle the windows. She took a deliberate sip of coffee before answering. Commander Chen, the lead officer said, saluting out of habit. Captain Rivera, SDF Patrol Division. We detected an unauthorized landing in this area. Sarah leaned against the doorframe, projecting casual indifference. Really, must have been napping. These mountain nights, so peaceful. Rivera's eyes narrowed. He was young, probably fresh out of the academy. Ma'am, we have thermal readings indicating 2 non-human life forms. Protocol requires a warrant for searching the private residence of a retired commander with level 9 diplomatic clearance. Sarah interrupted smoothly. Do you have one, Captain? She watched him squirm, enjoying it more than she probably should. In the basement, she knew Lyra and Nova were listening through the floor vents. She hoped they appreciated the irony of their cultural observation, starting with this display of human bureaucracy in action. No, ma'am, Rivera admitted. But then I suggest you expand your search perimeter. The mountains are full of interesting thermal signatures. Bears, mountain lions, all sorts of non-human life forms. Rivera looked like he wanted to argue, but 15 years of diplomatic missions had given Sarah a stare that could freeze plasma. He wilted under it. We'll continue our search elsewhere, but we'll be monitoring the area. You do that, Captain. Good hunting. After they left, Sarah waited a full 30 minutes before opening the basement door. She found Lyra and Nova examining her wine collection with intense curiosity. These containers, Nova said, holding up a bottle, they're for chemical sustenance. Recreational chemical sustenance, Sarah corrected, taking the bottle. And this one's a 2045 carbonate that's worth more than your environmental suits. Fascinating, Lyra murmured. Your species deliberately consumes compounds that alter consciousness for pleasure. Among other reasons. Sarah grabbed 3 glasses. Speaking of which, I think we could all use some after that excitement. Consider it your first lesson in human culture. As she poured the wine, Sarah studied her guests more carefully. Their purple skin seemed to shift hues with each movement, like oil on water. Their eyes were large and silver, with vertical pupils that adjusted constantly to the light. So, she said, handing them each a glass. Want to tell me the real reason you're here? Lyra took a careful sip of wine, her eyes widening at the taste. The research mission is genuine, but perhaps we weren't entirely forthcoming about its scope. The Cetacean Alliance is changing, Nova added. The younger generation believes isolation has stunted our growth. We see humans pushing into the stars, adapting, evolving, while we remain static. And what do the older generations think? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. They believe contact should be limited, controlled, Lyra said. They fear contamination. Sarah snorted. Contamination. I heard the same argument from Earth's isolationists. We must preserve our pure human culture. As if culture isn't meant to grow and change. Exactly. Nova's enthusiasm made her skin pulse with bioluminescent patterns. We believe real understanding comes from immersion, from living alongside each other, not from sterile diplomatic meetings. Which is why you landed in my backyard instead of going through proper channels. Sarah sighed. You know they won't stop looking. We know, Lyra acknowledged, but our ship's cloaking systems are sophisticated. As long as we remain close to it, their senses won't detect us. Sarah swirled her wine thoughtfully. And what exactly do you hope to learn in 2 weeks? Everything, Nova exclaimed. Your daily routines, your customs, your interactions with your environment. The way you adapt technology to serve your needs while maintaining connections to your natural world. Like this, Lyra added, holding up her wine glass. A perfect blend of agricultural science and artistic expression. This is what we want to understand. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. Well, if you're going to study human culture, I suppose wine isn't a bad place to start. But tomorrow, we need to establish some ground rules. The nearest town is 10 miles away, but hikers come through these trails regularly. We can alter our appearance, Nova offered. Our environmental suits can mimic human skin tones and clothing. Good, because lesson 2 in human culture is going to be grocery shopping. I don't have enough food stored for 3 people for 2 weeks. Shopping. Lyra's eyes lit up. You mean the ritualized exchange of currency for goods? We've studied this, but never participated. Just remember, Sarah warned, you're supposed to be studying human culture, not drawing attention to yourselves. Nova was practically bouncing with excitement. We will be very discreet. You won't even know we're not human. The way her skin was currently flashing like a disco ball suggested otherwise, but Sarah kept that thought to herself. Instead, she poured more wine. To cultural exchange, she said, raising her glass, and to breaking all the rules in the name of science. As they touched glasses, Sarah reflected that retirement was turning out to be far more interesting than expected. She just hoped she wouldn't end up back in front of a diplomatic review board trying to explain why she was harboring alien fugitives. But watching Lyra and Nova's genuine wonder at something as simple as sharing wine, she decided it might be worth the risk. Sometimes the best way to bridge 2 worlds was to break a few rules along the way. Besides, she'd always been better at asking forgiveness than permission. The next morning dawned crisp and clear in the Colorado mountains. Sarah watched with barely contained amusement as Lyra and Nova emerged from their guest room wearing their human disguises. Their environmental suits had shifted to mimic casual hiking wear, and their purple skin now appeared a natural tan shade. Well, Nova spun in place, her formerly silver eyes now a warm brown. Do we look human enough? Almost, Sarah said, adjusting Nova's baseball cap. Just remember, no color changing, no bioluminescence, and try to blink regularly. Humans don't have third eyelids. This is so exciting, Lyra said, studying her reflection in the window. Real field research. Though I must say, your species' epidermal limitations are quite restrictive. Sarah grabbed her truck keys. Just wait until you experience human transportation. Speaking of which, we need a cover story. In a small town like Pine Valley, 2 strangers with me will definitely attract attention. We've studied human familial relationships, Nova offered. Perhaps we could be your sisters. With our different ethnic appearances, no, that wouldn't work in a town this size. Sarah thought for a moment. Former students. I occasionally taught xenodiplomacy seminars before retiring. That'll explain any cultural oddities. The drive into town was an adventure in itself. Lyra and Nova were fascinated by the primitive combustion vehicle, though Sarah had to repeatedly remind them not to scan it with their portable devices. Every curve in the mountain road elicited gasps of wonder at the changing views. Your world has so much variety, Lyra marveled. On our planet, the surface is mostly uniform, endless purple oceans under perpetual twilight. Sounds peaceful, Sarah commented, downshifting for a steep descent. Peaceful, yes, but also stagnant. Nova pressed her face against the window. Look, a small human settlement. Pine Valley appeared ahead, nestled in the valley like a toy town. Population 2,500, 1 main street, and enough small-town curiosity to make Sarah nervous. She popped behind the general store, turning to face her passengers. Remember, you're graduate students studying remote community dynamics. Let me do most of the talking, and whatever you do, don't. Sarah Chen, a booming voice interrupted, finally crawled out of your mountain hermitage. Mike Thompson, the store owner, was walking toward them with his characteristic friendly grin. Sarah silently cursed his timing. Mike, she nodded, trying to position herself between him and her companions. Just showing some former students around. Former students, eh? Mike's eyes twinkled with small-town curiosity. Don't remember you mentioning teaching. It was before I moved here, Sarah said smoothly. Lyra and Nova are doing research on isolated communities. Thought they might learn something from Pine Valley. Mike beamed. Well, you came to the right place. We're having our annual Heritage Festival this weekend. Whole town turns out. Best way to see real small-town culture in action. Sarah felt a spike of panic as Nova practically vibrated with excitement beside her. Oh, we wouldn't want to impose. Nonsense. Mike insisted. Your students would love it. Traditional crafts, local music, Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning pies. Can't get more authentic than that. A festival. Nova whispered to Lyra. A perfect opportunity to observe human social rituals. Sarah could practically see their researcher instincts overwhelming their caution. Before she could intervene, Lyra stepped forward with a perfectly practiced smile. We would be honored to attend, she said, her accent slightly too precise. What time does this cultural celebration begin? Mike gave her an odd look. European, right? Saturday at noon. The whole town will be there. After he walked away, Sarah leaned against her truck with a groan. This is exactly what we were trying to avoid. The whole town watching you. But think of the research opportunity, Nova pleaded. A gathering of humans celebrating their shared customs and history. We could learn so much. Or blow your cover spectacularly, Sarah muttered. But she knew that look in their eyes. The same burning curiosity that had driven them across the galaxy wouldn't be denied now. Fine, she conceded, but we're going to spend the next 3 days practicing how to act human in public. And no scanning devices, no data collection units, and absolutely no glowing. They loaded groceries into the truck, another fascinating cultural experience for the aliens who were amazed by the concept of preserving food through freezing and canning. As they drove back up the mountain, Sarah couldn't shake a feeling of impending chaos. You know, Lyra said thoughtfully, in all our research on human communities, one pattern emerges consistently: they're incredibly adaptable. When faced with the unknown, they adjust, incorporate, evolve. Your point? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew where this was going. Perhaps we shouldn't worry so much about perfect mimicry. Small towns especially, they accept oddness in their own way. As long as you're part of the community, they'd often overlook quirks. Sarah considered this as they wound their way home. She'd chosen Pine Valley precisely because it accepted her own oddness, the retired space commander who wanted solitude. Maybe Lyra had a point. Just promise me one thing, she said finally. No matter what happens at this festival, try to remember you were supposed to be human. No getting overexcited about simple things like cotton candy or face painting. Nova's blank expression made Sarah sigh. Right. Add carnival foods to our crash course in human behavior. This is going to be an interesting week. As they unloaded groceries, Sarah caught herself smiling. For all her protests, she had to admit, life had gotten a lot more interesting since her students arrived. And maybe, just maybe, this festival wouldn't be a complete disaster. Though she made a mental note to keep them far away from Mrs. Henderson's famous moonshine. The last thing they needed was to discover how alcohol affected cetacean biology in front of the whole town. The day of the Heritage Festival arrived with perfect Colorado weather, crisp mountain air and cloudless skies. Sarah had spent the past 3 days drilling Lyra and Nova on proper human behavior, but their enthusiasm kept overwhelming their caution. Remember, Sarah said as they walked toward the town square, no matter what you see, stay calm. Act like you've seen it all before. Of course, Lyra assured her, though her eyes were already wide at the colorful banners and bustling crowds. "We are professionals." "Absolutely," Nova agreed, while practically bouncing on her toes. "Though I must ask, why are those small humans being painted to resemble terrestrial fauna?" "It's called face painting," Sarah explained patiently. "It's fun, for kids. Very normal, nothing to get excited about." "Fascinating," Nova whispered, a bit too loudly. "The ritualistic decoration of offspring for recreational purposes." Sarah steered them toward the craft booths, hoping to avoid drawing attention. It worked for about 5 minutes, until they reached old Joe's woodworking display. "Look," Lyra exclaimed, holding up a carved bird. "They recreate organic life forms from processed tree matter. The technological implications alone are very basic." Sarah cut in smoothly as old Joe raised an eyebrow. "Simple craft, really, very traditional." They managed to escape that situation, only to run straight into Mrs. Henderson's pie contest display. Sarah had forgotten about the cetacean's enhanced sense of smell. "These aromas are incredible," Nova breathed, her disguised skin threatening to ripple with excitement. "The complex chemical reactions involved in heating these organic compounds." "They're just pies," Sarah hissed. "Act normal." "Everything okay there, Sarah?" Mrs. Henderson called out. "Your students seem mighty interested in my baking." "They're culinary anthropologists," Sarah improvised, "studying traditional American desserts." "Oh, how wonderful," Mrs. Henderson beamed. "You simply must try my blue ribbon apple pie. It's a family recipe, 5 generations old." Before Sarah could protest, both aliens were presented with generous slices. She held her breath as they took their first bites, praying their environmental suits could process human food. The look of pure wonder that crossed their faces was almost worth the risk. "This is..." Lyra seemed at a loss for words, a first in Sarah's experience. The complexity of flavors, the textural variations, the subtle interplay of sweetness and acidity, Nova added, closing her eyes in bliss. "Truly, humans are masters of sensory engineering." Mrs. Henderson practically glowed with pride. "Well, aren't you two the sweetest things? Such lovely manners. You know, Sarah, you should bring your students around more often." As they moved away from the pie display, Sarah relaxed slightly. Maybe this wouldn't be a disaster after all. Then she heard the first notes of the band starting up. "Is that acoustic vibration patterns for recreational purposes?" Nova asked, her eyes sparkling. "Dancing," Lyra exclaimed. "We study human rhythmic movement customs extensively in theory, but to observe it in practice." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Absolutely not. You are not going to." But they were already moving toward the dance floor, drawn by the lively fiddle music. Sarah watched in horror as they joined the forming line dance. To her amazement, they weren't half bad. Their natural grace and extensive theoretical study actually made them look like they knew what they were doing. They copied the movements of the humans around them with perfect precision, if perhaps a bit too perfect. "Your students are quite the dancers," Mike commented, appearing beside her. "Though their style is a bit unique." Sarah forced a laugh. European folk dancing influence. Very different tradition. She was about to suggest they leave while their luck held when a commotion broke out near the festival entrance. 2 men in dark suits were showing badges to the sheriff. Sarah's heart sank. She recognized those suits. SDF Intelligence Division. "Time to go," she muttered, trying to catch Lyra and Nova's attention without being obvious. But they were thoroughly engrossed in a complicated do-see-do. The agents were working their way through the crowd, showing photos to people. Sarah knew exactly what those photos showed: thermal imaging of 2 distinctly non-human forms. Just then, the sky darkened. People looked up, pointing and murmuring as clouds seemed to gather from nowhere. "Strange," Mike said, frowning. Forecast was clear all day. Sarah knew better. She'd seen cetacean weather manipulation technology before. Lyra and Nova had called their ship. The first drops of rain sent people scurrying for cover. Within seconds, it was pouring. The agents looked up in frustration as their quarry disappeared in the chaos of people running for shelter. Sarah felt a hand grab hers. "This way," Lyra whispered. "The ship's cloaking field will cover our retreat." They ran through the rain, which seemed to part around them like a curtain. Behind them, Sarah could hear the agents shouting, but the strange storm masked their escape. By the time they reached Sarah's truck, they were somehow completely dry despite the downpour. Nova was clutching a piece of pie in a takeout container. Was the weather manipulation really necessary? Sarah asked as they sped back toward the cabin. "Standard emergency protocol," Lyra explained. "Though I must say, the pie was worth the risk of discovery." Mrs. Henderson's baking should be classified as a cultural treasure, Nova agreed solemnly. "We'll need to include a special section about it in our research." Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "You realize we can never go back to that town now. They'll have too many questions." "Perhaps," Lyra said thoughtfully. "But we learned something valuable today about human communities. They're far more accepting of differences than our studies suggested. Until those agents arrived, no one questioned our uniqueness. They just accepted us," Nova added, "even with our imperfect mimicry." Sarah was quiet for a moment, navigating the wet mountain roads. "That's the thing about small towns," she said finally. "They're not always as small-minded as you'd think. Given the chance, humans can be surprisingly adaptable." "Which is exactly what our research is trying to prove," Lyra said softly. As they drove through the mysterious rain that affected only the town behind them, Sarah reflected that maybe the aliens weren't the only ones doing research. Maybe she was learning something too, about trust, acceptance, and the unexpected joy of sharing her solitude. Though she was definitely going to have to explain to Mrs. Henderson why her students disappeared in a rainstorm with her prize-winning pie. The aftermath of the festival turned Sarah's quiet mountain retreat into an impromptu war room. While Nova continued her enthusiastic analysis of Mrs. Henderson's pie, Lyra and Sarah pored over satellite data on a holographic display projected from their environmental suits. "The SDF has established a perimeter," Lyra reported, pointing to red dots surrounding Pine Valley. "They're methodically sweeping the mountains, using advanced thermal imaging." Sarah rubbed her temples. "Your ship's cloaking can handle that, right?" "For now," Lyra admitted, "but they're adapting their scanning frequencies. It's only a matter of time." Nova looked up from her pie analysis. "Perhaps we should simply leave. Our research, while fascinating, isn't worth causing Commander Chen further trouble." The suggestion made Sarah unexpectedly uncomfortable. After just a week, she'd grown accustomed to her alien house guests. The cabin would feel empty without Nova's endless questions and Lyra's thoughtful observations. "No," Sarah said firmly. "We're not done here. Besides, running now would only confirm their suspicions about Pine Valley. The whole town could come under investigation." A knock at the door made them all freeze. The hologram vanished as Lyra and Nova's suits quickly shifted back to their human disguises. Sarah checked the security screen and cursed softly. "It's Mike, from the store." "How did he find your cabin?" Lyra whispered. "Small town," Sarah muttered. "Everyone knows where everyone lives. They just usually respect my privacy." She opened the door to find Mike standing there with a covered dish and a concerned expression. "Mike," she said, trying to sound casual, "what brings you up the mountain?" "Thought I'd check on you and your students," he said, peering past her. "After that strange storm and all, brought some of Martha's casserole." Sarah knew that look. In small towns, casseroles were diplomatic tools used to soften the blow of difficult conversations. "Come in," she sighed. "No point prolonging the inevitable." Mike's eyes widened slightly at seeing Lyra and Nova, but he covered it well. "Ladies, quite a show you put on at the festival." "We enjoyed the traditional dance ritual immensely," Nova said brightly, then winced as Lyra elbowed her. Mike set down the casserole and fixed Sarah with a steady gaze. You know, funny thing about that storm. Weather Service says it never happened. No radar signature, no precipitation recorded, just eyewitnesses. Weather strange in the mountains, Sarah offered weakly. Aha. Mike pulled out his phone. Also funny, got some interesting pictures before the rain hit. Meant to show you at the festival, but you disappeared so quick. He held up the phone, showing a photo of Lyra and Nova dancing. In the moment of movement captured, their environmental suits had glitched. Streaks of purple skin showed through their disguises. Now, I'm just a simple store owner, Mike continued, but I was in the Air Force before that. Saw some things that weren't supposed to exist. Things that might explain why those government types were asking questions. Sarah tensed, ready to act if necessary. But Mike's next words surprised her. Also saw how those same government types tend to handle things they don't understand. Usually with lots of paperwork, quarantines, and people disappearing into debriefings that last years. He looked at Lyra and Nova. Your dancing was too perfect. No human learns moves that precise just from watching. And no grad students I ever met talk about pi like it's a scientific miracle. Mike, Sarah started, but he held up a hand. Not finished. See, Pine Valley's got a history of keeping secrets. During World War II, this whole valley helped hide Jewish refugees. Civil rights era, we were a stop on a different kind of underground railroad. We protect our own. We're not exactly who we claim to be, Lyra said carefully. Mike laughed. Ladies, I've been selling groceries to Sarah for 3 years. Never seen her smile as much as she did watching you two discover human culture. Far as I'm concerned, that makes you part of Pine Valley. The SDF is searching the mountains, Sarah warned. Yep, and every hunter, hiker, and ranger in the valley is accidentally giving them wrong directions, reporting false sightings, and generally making their job harder. Mike grinned. Small towns are funny that way. We stick together. Nova's eyes were shining. This is amazing. A spontaneous community defense mechanism, activating to protect outsiders who've been accepted as insiders. We never documented anything like this in our studies. Nova, Lyra sighed, you're not helping maintain our cover. But Mike just laughed harder. Don't worry about cover with me, though you might want to work on your casual conversation skills before meeting anyone else. Sarah felt tension she hadn't realized she was carrying melt away. So, you're really okay with this? With them? Sarah, half this town thinks you're some kind of secret agent anyway, with your mysterious past and fancy security system. Having alien house guests actually makes you more normal, far as we're concerned. He headed for the door, then paused. Oh, and Mrs. Henderson wants her pie tin back, and the recipe for whatever Nova did to analyze it so perfectly. Says she's never had such detailed feedback on her baking. After he left, Sarah turned to her stunned guests. Well, that was unexpected. Humans continue to surprise us, Lyra mused. All our studies suggested small, isolated communities would be the most xenophobic. Instead, they're protecting us, Nova finished, using their very isolation as a weapon against discovery. Sarah smiled, serving up Martha's casserole. Maybe that's the real story you should be researching. Not how humans adapt to the galaxy, but how they help others adapt to humanity. As they ate, plans were made. The town would help misdirect the SDF. The aliens would work on better disguises, and Sarah realized she didn't mind her quiet retirement being a little less quiet. Though she did make them promise to stop analyzing every meal like it was a scientific breakthrough. Some things, she insisted, were better appreciated than studied. Even if Nova did create the most detailed analysis of comfort food chemistry the galaxy had ever seen. 2 weeks had stretched into 3, and Sarah's cabin had become the unlikely center of a quiet revolution. The living room was now part command center, part cultural exchange hub. Mike and a few trusted townspeople would visit regularly, bringing food and news of SDF movements, while taking away fascinating insights from their alien guests. They're setting up a permanent base, Mike reported one evening, spreading out a map. Converting the old ranger station. Whatever you folks are, they're mighty determined to find you. Our extraction team is still 4 days out, Lyra said, her holographic displays showing a distant ship's approach. We've managed to encrypt our communications, but they'll detect a ship that size entering atmosphere, Sarah finished. No way to hide that. Nova looked up from where she was teaching Mrs. Henderson the scientific principles behind perfect pie crust. Perhaps we don't need to hide. Perhaps it's time for a different approach. Everyone turned to look at her. Nova rarely contributed to strategic discussions, usually being too absorbed in her cultural studies. What do you mean? Lyra asked. Well, Nova said thoughtfully, our mission was to prove that humans and cetaceans could coexist naturally, without diplomatic oversight. Haven't we done exactly that? She gestured around the room. Look at us, sharing knowledge, forming bonds, building trust. Not because of treaties or protocols, but because of simple human hospitality. And pie, Mrs. Henderson added with a smile. And pie, Nova agreed sullenly. A perfect metaphor for cultural fusion, actually, taking separate ingredients and creating something greater than their individual. Nova, Lyra interrupted gently, focus. Right. My point is, maybe we should stop running. Instead of hiding what we've achieved here, we should showcase it. Sarah frowned. You want to go public, the SDF world would have to acknowledge that their worst fears never materialized. Mike cut in, catching on. No infiltration, no security breaches, no cultural contamination. Just neighbors helping neighbors. It's risky, Lyra warned. The conservative factions in both our societies. We'll have to adapt, Nova said firmly. Just like we did, just like Pine Valley did. The room fell quiet as everyone considered the implications. Finally, Sarah spoke. We'd need to do it carefully, control the narrative, and we'd need the whole town's support. Mike snorted. You already have it. Why do you think Mrs. Henderson's been teaching Nova about pie? Or why old Joe keeps bringing his wood carvings? The whole town's been preparing for this, whether they knew it or not. It's true, Mrs. Henderson said. Every time someone new figures it out, they just sort of fold into the conspiracy, like it's the most natural thing in the world. Sarah looked at her alien friends. Over the past weeks, they'd become more than research subjects or fugitives. They'd become part of the community, part of her life. If we do this, she said slowly, there's no going back. For any of us. This town, your mission, my retirement, everything changes. Lyra's expression was thoughtful. Perhaps change is what both our peoples need. We came here to study human adaptation. Maybe it's time we prove cetaceans can adapt too. Besides, Nova added, I still haven't mastered the art of pie crimping. Clearly, our research is incomplete. The next few days were a flurry of activity. The town held emergency meetings disguised as bake sales. Sarah dusted off her old diplomatic contacts. Lyra and Nova prepared their research findings, documenting every instance of successful cultural integration. When the cetacean extraction ship arrived, they were ready. Instead of a covert pickup, they staged a public landing in the town square. Sarah stood with Lyra and Nova, watching as their ship descended through the clouds, its massive form shimmering like an iridescent whale swimming through the sky. The SDF arrived minutes later, of course, but instead of finding hidden aliens, they found a town celebration in full swing. Banners welcomed their celestial sister city. Children played with glowing toys made from modified cetacean technology. Mrs. Henderson was serving pie to amazed alien diplomats. This is unprecedented, one SDF officer sputtered. The protocols are clearly outdated, Sarah interrupted smoothly, falling easily back into her diplomatic role. As this town has demonstrated, true cultural exchange doesn't need oversight. It needs openness, trust, and apparently really good pie. The aftermath was chaotic, as paradigm shifts usually are. Investigations were launched, hearings were held, diplomatic missions were hastily arranged. But in the end, Pine Valley's example proved too powerful to ignore. The town became a model for a new kind of cultural exchange program. Small groups of cetaceans would live among human communities, while human volunteers visited cetacean worlds. No formal oversight, no diplomatic handlers, just people learning from people, or whatever species they happen to be. You know, Nova said on their last night in the cabin, I don't think this is what our superiors expected when they sent us to study human adaptation. No, Lyra agreed, but it's exactly what they needed to see. Humans don't just adapt to new situations. They help others adapt too. Sarah looked around her living room, now bearing traces of both human and cetacean influence. Will you come back to visit? Once all the diplomatic dust settles. Of course, Nova said immediately. Mrs. Henderson promised to teach me her secret pie spice blend. And I need to finish my analysis of human storytelling customs, Lyra added. Mike's collection of what he calls dad jokes is particularly puzzling. Sarah laughed. Well, my door's always open. Though maybe next time, try using it instead of crash landing in my backyard. As they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple that matched the cetacean's natural skin tone, Sarah reflected on how quickly the unexpected could become the natural. Her quiet retirement had turned into something far more interesting, a bridge between worlds, built not by diplomats and politicians, but by ordinary people sharing ordinary moments. And maybe that was the real lesson. Sometimes the biggest changes don't come from grand gestures or official policies. Sometimes they come from simple things, like welcoming strangers, sharing meals, and being willing to see the extraordinary in the everyday. Even if it takes a pair of alien anthropologists and a small mountain town to show the rest of the universe how it's done. 1 year later, Sarah's cabin had changed almost as much as the town below it. Solar panels with a distinctly alien sheen powered an expanded kitchen where human and cetacean cooking techniques merged. The living room now featured a three-dimensional communication array disguised as a rustic chandelier. And the garden, well, the garden had become something of a local legend. I still can't believe you got cetacean bioluminescent flowers to grow in Earth's soil, Mike said, watching the sunset make the garden glow in waves of gentle color. Martha's been pestering me to ask for seeds. Sarah smiled, pouring coffee for her human guests and a shimmering blue liquid for her alien ones. The monthly cultural exchange meetings had become a tradition, drawing visitors from both worlds. Nova's the one who figured it out, she said, nodding toward the alien botanist who was currently teaching a group of local children how to communicate with the light-responsive plants. Something about adapting their genetic structure to Earth's day-night cycle. And adding a touch of Mrs. Henderson's organic fertilizer, Nova added, her environmental suit now programmed to shift naturally between human and cetacean appearances. The chemistry was fascinating. Lyra, who had just returned from a conference where she presented their groundbreaking research on informal interspecies relations, settled into what had become her favorite armchair. The garden is becoming quite the metaphor. Life from different worlds, not just coexisting but creating something entirely new. Speaking of new, Mike said, pulling out his tablet, wait until you see the latest tourism numbers. Ever since Pine Valley became the unofficial Earth Cetacean Friendship Capital, the town had indeed changed. What started as a secret had blossomed into a unique cultural phenomenon. The Heritage Festival now featured both traditional Earthcrafts and cetacean art. The general store stocked alien delicacies alongside local produce. The high school offered xenolinguistics classes taught by visiting cetacean scholars. Did you ever imagine, Sarah asked her alien friends, when you crash-landed in my backyard, that it would lead to all this? Actually, Nova confessed, we didn't exactly crash-land. Everyone turned to look at her. Even Lyra seemed surprised. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Nova's skin rippled with embarrassment patterns visible through her suit. Well, we might have selected your location deliberately. Our research showed you were the perfect combination of human diplomatic experience and small-town integration. We needed someone who could bridge both worlds. So you faked a crash landing? Mike asked, impressed. That's some dedicated research methodology. The ship's malfunction was quite real, Lara clarified, giving Nova a look. We just might have encouraged it to happen at a specific place and time. Sarah sat back, processing this revelation. All this time, I thought I was helping you by accident, but you planned it. Not all of it, Nova said quickly. We never expected the town's response, or the SDF pursuit, or certainly not becoming the model for a new type of interstellar relations. We planned the beginning, Lyra added. Everything else was pure human unpredictability, which, ironically, proved our research thesis better than any controlled study could have. Mrs. Henderson, who had arrived with her latest experimental human cetacean fusion pie, laughed heartily. Well, I'd say it worked out just fine. Though next time you want to study humans, maybe just knock on the door. The gathering continued as the bioluminescent garden cast its gentle glow over the scene. Children played with floating light orbs while their parents discussed everything from recipes to quantum physics. A group of cetacean tourists practiced square dancing under Mike's enthusiastic instruction. In the kitchen, Nova was teaching a cooking class that combined Earth ingredients with alien techniques. Sarah watched it all from her porch, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Her quiet retirement had turned into something far more interesting. A living laboratory of human-alien cooperation. But unlike the sterile diplomatic missions of her past, this was organic, natural, growing from genuine connections and shared experiences. Penny for your thoughts? Lyra asked, joining her on the porch. Just thinking about adaptation, Sarah replied. How sometimes the best way to adapt isn't to change yourself, but to help change the world around you. A very human perspective, Lyra noted. On our world, we sought to control change, to maintain stability at all costs. But here, she gestured at the lively scene before them. Here, change is celebrated, incorporated, transformed into progress. Inside, they could hear Nova excitedly explaining the quantum mechanics of pie crust formation to a fascinated audience. Mrs. Henderson was taking detailed notes. The university wants us to expand the program, Lyra continued. Set up similar exchanges in other small towns around Earth. They think we've discovered a new model for interspecies relations. Have we? Sarah asked. Perhaps. Or perhaps we simply rediscovered something humans knew all along, that the best way to bridge differences is to share a meal, tell stories, and be willing to look foolish while learning each other's dances. As if on cue, the sound of Mike attempting to pronounce a complex cetacean greeting, and getting it endearingly wrong, drifted out from the cabin, followed by friendly laughter from both species. You know, Sarah said, when I retired, I thought I was done with diplomatic missions. Turns out I just needed to find the right kind of diplomacy. The garden's lights pulsed gently in agreement, Earth's sunset mixing with alien bioluminescence to paint the sky in colors no single world could produce alone. It was beautiful, unexpected, and entirely natural, just like the community that had grown around her cabin on the mountain. Next month, Nova called from inside. We're hosting the first interstellar baking competition. Mrs. Henderson's already working on a pie that changes flavors based on the eater's mood. Sarah laughed. Some might say the universe wasn't ready for mood-sensing pie. But then again, they'd probably said the same thing about alien anthropologists in a small mountain town. Sometimes the best discoveries happened when you stopped trying to control every variable and just let life surprise you. Even if those surprises came with a side of experimental pie and glowing flowers.